The MMO genre and I have a sordid history together. For a reason I couldn't articulate at the time, I was extremely skeptical and dismissive of every title bearing the genre distinction. Looking back, a large part of it was simply due to a lack of access. My PC couldn't handle much in the way of gaming, and none of my consoles had the extra peripherals necessary for internet connectivity, meaning games like Final Fantasy XI and Phantasy Star Online were a complete no-go. This not even getting into the fact that I was a broke teenager without a job. Which meant that the subscription model proved to be the biggest obstacle, as there was no way in hell I was ever going to convince my parents to shell out money on a monthly basis for a single game. So these were the reasons why I couldn't, physically play any of them, but that doesn't really explain just what about the genre gave me bad vibes. Believe it or not, it goes a little deeper than simply not being able to play them, which is a bit shocking considering I was a pretentiously shallow adolescent. For starters, the public perception was such that only the transcendently geeky were into it, an idea that was perpetuated by the South Park episode, Make Love, Not Warcraft. Simply put, stuff like that really didn't help a kid like me that read manga in class like a fucking dork. Oh man, I was nerdy enough as it was, and I did not need something receiving so much public ridicule, making things even worse. Then again, in retrospect, it wasn't dissimilar from a kid trying to hide in the middle of a room with a blanket over his head. I'd already done a bang-up job proving my sheer nerdiness, and avoiding World of Warcraft wouldn't have made much of a difference. I will at least say that in my defense, it wasn't entirely for superficial reasons that I denounced MMOs, as I had also taken umbrage with how these games seemed to be obscenely long. That might be ironic coming from someone that loves RPGs, but at least those games tended to end after 60 or so hours, as opposed to the hundreds and even thousands of hours it takes to experience the abundance of content in your typical MMO. On top of that, a lot of these titles tended to be on the PC platform, and considering I was predominantly into console gaming at the time, I was very inexperienced with keyboard and mouse controls, which added a sense of intimidation. This next one is more anecdotal in nature, but I remember hearing from friends about how they would gather together huge groups of players in World of Warcraft in an attempt to take down some of the tougher bosses, only to get absolutely slaughtered in the process. This may have been hyperbolic and performative on their part to make the game seem more amusing, but whether it was true or not, this did little to endear me. The idea of spending lots of time in preparation only to get wiped and have to start over sounded like fucking torture to me. I'm sure some people will point out that I wasn't being totally fair and that these complaints don't apply to every game in the genre, but keep in mind that I was a stupid kid in high school and my critical thinking skills were at an all-time low during these formative years. All that being said, despite my misgivings, there was in fact one game that managed to change my mind and push me into finally seeing firsthand what the hell MMORPGs were all about. And it was for a pretty obvious reason in retrospect. The thing was free and looked like shit, so my PC could run it without breaking a sweat. The game in question is RuneScape, which was the first and for a long time the only MMORPG I ever played. I don't remember exactly what happened that pushed me over the edge. It may have been some friends of mine that goaded me into it, but it was also likely that at the end of the day, I secretly wanted to try an MMORPG the entire time, and this was my excuse to actually play one. It wouldn't be the only time I wasn't honest with myself, especially in my younger days. An important detail to note is that this happened around the mid-2000s, and at the time, being able to play with and against other players online was still a rather new and novel concept, especially for me. Online gaming wouldn't really take off and become mainstream until the PS3 and Xbox 360 had built-in Wi-Fi connectivity. This was a few years before that, so being able to play RuneScape at the time felt like a wholly unique experience. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of things, let's take a trip down memory lane of when I initially booted up the game. I quickly finished the tutorial and was then able to interact with other players in an online setting for the very first time, something I had never done before in any game prior. Upon the realization that I could just type out anything I wanted to literally anyone, like the juvenile little shit that I was, I began cussing out everyone around me. While the game did censor my curse words, that fact did little to stop me in my potty-mouthed rampage as I continued to dish out expletives with reckless abandon. During this display of temporary insanity, I distinctly remember a random player misguidedly attempting to approach me, probably just trying to be nice, wanting to help out someone new to the game. I don't recall exactly what they said, but regardless of what it was, I proceeded to respond by delivering a barrage of F-bombs like they owed me money. All the while, I was crying with laughter, and I mean that literally. I was cackling so hard that actual tears were streaming down my face. There was something delightfully absurd about being able to just yell at people for no reason. The level of freedom I felt in that moment was utterly intoxicating and hilarious, at least to me and my awful sense of humor at the time. Thankfully, I did eventually get bored of acting like a fucking lunatic to random strangers, and I started playing the actual game to see what it had to offer. Now, rather than talk about the mechanics or the game design, I want to focus on the social aspect more than anything else, because this is what truly defined the experience for me. While occasionally I did play with a few real-life friends, most of the time I palled around with a number of players I crossed paths with during my adventures. I remember there was one guy in particular that would enthusiastically yell my name every time I logged on, and then for some inexplicable reason, we got into the habit of singing song lyrics to each other in the chat. There was another friend that relied on me for my high pickaxing skill, and I would get into the habit of procuring some rare ores for him. There was someone else who used to mine along with me, and we would chat about Final Fantasy, and a few others who were new to the game that I would help out and show the ropes. Not all of it was sunshine and roses, of course. I did block a few jerks here and there, and there were a few weird interactions, just, oh god, fueled by teen angst and stupidity that I'd rather just forget about. But even then, it was those weird experiences that in part made RuneScape so memorable for me. Now, some of you might be asking, that's great and all, but what about the game itself? Well, the reason I wanted to focus on the social aspect more than anything else is because looking back, I don't actually remember that much about how it plays. Sad as it may be, despite the fact I poured possibly hundreds of hours into RuneScape, I have no stirring tales of victory, prevailing over powerful foes, earning epic loot in a fantastic fashion, or even a vague recollection of what the hell the game's story was about. Instead, whenever my mind wanders back, the accompanying memories are almost always tied to the experiences I had with others. That's not to say there wasn't more to it, but at least based on what I remember, the actual moment-to-moment gameplay wasn't especially interesting, offering instead a lot of breadth, but not a ton of depth. RuneScape provided a plethora of activities from questing, gathering, and crafting, hours upon hours of content to enjoy, and to the game's credit, a good chunk of it without having to shell out a dime. The drawback of it being free, however, is that none of it is mechanically engaging. Given that it predominantly came down to clicking at things and watching your character do an animation in order to see numbers gradually get bigger, there was not much in the way of strategy or twitchy reflexes in combat either, as it also just came down to clicking at enemies and watching your character attack them. Ultimately, the gameplay in nearly all aspects boiled down to how much time you got to spare in order to gain a high enough level to do something else. Again, it's been a long time since I played the game, so if you're a big fan of RuneScape and that offended you, don't take it the wrong way. I'm sure there is much more to the game than what I'm saying here. This is just based on really old memories. All that being said, it's funny because these were the exact complaints I had going into the genre, mainly that these games felt like a huge time sink. Yet here I was doing just that. The thing is though, I was able to forgive RuneScape because the main draw for me outside of the simple satisfaction of seeing numbers go up was hanging out with buddies. And to that end, the game itself didn't really actually matter. I was a lonely kid and it was a way for me to make friends. At the end of the day, it was the people that made the game, not RuneScape itself as a piece of entertainment. This inevitably begs the question, why'd I stop playing? I want to say this was around the mid to late 2000s, I'm not totally sure, but one day I logged in like normal and immediately surmised that something was wrong. It was a detail that was hard to miss. My character wasn't wearing the rune armor I worked so hard to get. Considering the game itself is called RuneScape, you can bet your ass that anything made out of the stuff was the best of the best. I remember running to the bank with the vain hope that maybe I had just put it away for some inexplicable reason, only to realize that it wasn't just all of my rune equipment that went missing, but pretty much all of my valuables were gone as well. Nearly everything I worked hard to obtain simply vanished. It was painfully obvious that my account was compromised. Some asshole hacked into it and robbed me blind. While I wasn't some high-level player, a feat that takes a considerable amount of time, believe me, I was far from a wet behind the ears newbie. I had put countless hours into the game, and to see the digital representation of my accomplishments vanish overnight, it honestly broke my spirit. So much so that this event single-handedly not only convinced me to completely abandon RuneScape and never return to it, which I still haven't, by the way, it also soured me on the genre as a whole for a very long time. I have to admit, however, that by that point, I wasn't playing it as much as I used to. A decent chunk of my friends had stopped playing, and since the game itself wasn't fully sustained by the merits of its mechanics, it meant that there was less and less reason for me to go back, and this was the final straw. If there was one positive to come from it, it at least made for a funny story that I proceeded to embellish to my friends, telling them that the perpetrator left me naked in a PvP area. This is what they call pouring on the hot sauce. Sometimes the truth isn't spicy enough, so you gotta add some kick in order to distract from the blandness. Luckily, I was able to fill in the void pretty easily. I always had other games to play between new releases and older stuff in my backlog. So while what happened to me still stung, it was far from the only game left for me to enjoy. Granted, pretty much all of them were single-player experiences, lacking the online component that made RuneScape alluring to begin with, but that was okay, I didn't need it anymore. I was actually making more friends in real life by this point. Not to mention, it was technically that aspect of the game that ultimately ruined it for me in the end, as it was another player that hacked me. So, good riddance was my attitude. I imagine that even if my account didn't get hacked, I would have given up on the game at some point anyways, given that its usefulness to me was already waning. As I've said before, my friends shaped the RuneScape experience for me, not the game itself. Thus, if the people aren't there anymore, then there was no reason for me to return to that world. It was as good as empty in my eyes. Years go by and most MMOs just pass me by with only a few stray exceptions. I believe that the first one I played since RuneScape was the PC version of Phantasy Star Online, which was free to play via private servers. I remember toying around with it for a while, and I did enjoy it, but it didn't grip me or my friends anymore after a certain point. It's also a bit debatable as to whether it even counts as an MMO, considering that for all intents and purposes, it's a fairly small scale game, more of an action RPG with online components than anything else. After it was another one called DC Universe Online that went free to play around 2011. I tried it for a bit, but quickly lost interest. I distinctly remember enjoying it with friends and having a decent time with it at first, but when they didn't keep up with it, neither did I. Both of these were less earnest shots at giving the genre another chance, and more so just something to play with friends at the time. While all of this was happening, version 1.0 of Final Fantasy XIV came out in 2010 with an infamously disastrous launch. I'm sure you've all heard of it before, but for the uninitiated, it was plagued by technical issues such as server crashes, bugs, lack of story, an empty overworld, and outdated mechanics. It'd become a laughingstock for years after it came out. Now, I had no interest in it even before it was released, but just hearing how bad it turned out prompted me to file it away in my brain as a title that was absolutely never worth touching. However, just as I and everyone else forgot the game even existed, 2013 rolls around, and something unexpected happens. Out of nowhere, and against all odds, Final Fantasy XIV miraculously turned itself around by relaunching as Realm Reborn, transforming the failed MMO into a respectable product that people were loving. I remember almost being swept up by the positivity surrounding it and wanting to give FF14 a shot, but ultimately being dissuaded by the monthly subscription, something I wouldn't have been able to sustain given the lack of a job at the time, as I was a full-time college student. This time I figured, well, maybe it is good, but I probably won't play it anyways. I've been burned too many times now. And even though DC Universe Online and Phantasy Star Online didn't leave me nearly as cold and bitter as RuneScape, I was ultimately left disappointed by the both of them, in some fashion or another. Taking all of this into consideration, I concluded that MMOs just aren't for me. In my mind, it was a genre that would forever elude me, and that RuneScape was just a fluke. One that I didn't really even enjoy on its own merits. 2017 rolls around, and boy, let me tell you, that was a fantastic year for games. Tons of bangers roll out. Nier Automata, Breath of the Wild, Resident Evil 7, Neo, What Remains of Edith Finch. Honestly, I could go on. It was an amazing year for games, wherein I had my hands full playing as many as I could afford. However, there was another release that flew under my radar at the time, the Final Fantasy XIV expansion Stormblood. 4 years later, and somehow this game keeps popping back up? Not just refusing to stay dead, but continuing to gain momentum. I was still far from interested in it at this point, but it was getting harder to ignore, despite being well in the fringes of my periphery. That was until early 2019, when suddenly my friend Alex, whom some of you might know from the YouTube channel Backlog Battle, began his mission to get me into the game by extolling its virtues. Given everything that's been discussed so far, you all know the bad track record I have with the genre. And even though it's been several years at this point since the likes of RuneScape, for me it was still hard to fully let go of those negative feelings, manifesting into a misguided stubbornness. To his credit, Alex didn't go overboard. He wasn't badgering me to play it, nor was he constantly yapping about it, but rather gently reminded me on occasion during our conversations of its positive qualities. A particular point in FF14's favor that he spearheaded is the story-based content that ties into both Final Fantasy Tactics and the, at the time, recently announced Nier Automata raids. Even someone as jaded as I had taken notice. Final Fantasy Tactics is my favorite game in the franchise, and Nier Automata was my game of the year of 2017. So not only was I keenly interested in seeing more content from these titles, but I was also just absolutely bewildered by how they could possibly fit into FF14. The idea seemed strange on the face of it, yet oddly alluring at the same time. Still, I wasn't fully convinced. It also didn't help that it would take quite literally hundreds of hours to even reach said content. But what finally made me budge was when I was told that the game had a free trial that lasted until level 35. I honestly had no reason to, at the very least, give it a try. What did I have to lose? So one day, Alex and I hopped on a voice chat as I booted up FF14 for the first time. I'm greeted by a beautiful CGI intro movie whose context at the time was utterly lost on me. Afterwards, I finally get into the game itself, only to be greeted with a plethora of tutorials and some rather dull fetch quests before I see any combat. And when I do, it looks like this. Yeah. Needless to say, I was feeling underwhelmed, which admittedly wasn't totally fair given that this is a huge world that I've seen very little of, but I couldn't help but shake that this just wasn't that interesting to me. Honestly, after I put it down, I didn't feel the need to pick it back up. To his credit, while Alex did try to get me back into it, he never forced the issue. Little did either of us know at the time, but the biggest shakeup in Final Fantasy XIV was yet to come. In July of that year, the game's third expansion, Shadowbringers, would come out, and the fan base erupted with elation, hailing it as not just the very best that the game itself has to offer, but also one of the best pieces of Final Fantasy content to ever release. Most relevant to me, however, was that Shadowbringers came with it some important updates. An extension to the free trial, which raised the level cap to 60, while also including the first expansion, Heavensward. This alone would have been enough, but the development team decided to take things even further. They re-examined the quests in A Realm Reborn and made adjustments by way of trimming and providing bigger experience payouts in order to speed along players through the main quest and into the ostensibly superior expansion content. Armed with these new quality of life improvements, Alex once more attempted to persuade me into giving FF14 another chance. Not only did he tell me about how the free trial had been beefed up, which genuinely did go a long way in convincing me to give the game another go, but this time he told me that instead of treating it like an MMORPG, that I should instead look at it as a single-player Final Fantasy game with online components. If I were to play armchair psychologist for a moment and self-analyze, I believe that by removing the idea of the genre in my head, this made it easier for me to accept it as just another Final Fantasy game. Hearing all of this, I decided it was time to return to the realm of Eorzea and give Final Fantasy XIV one final chance. Truthfully, I don't know exactly what changed for me, but suddenly it felt like I was making progress in a way I wasn't the first time we played together. Alex and I were going from location to location, doing quests, fighting monsters, learning new abilities. All of a sudden, I realized that I was actually having fun. When it was time to stop, it stuck in my mind. I wanted to keep the upward momentum going. Initially, I told him that I would only play the game together with him on weekends. But despite that declaration, the very next day, without my friend needing to hold my hand anymore, I was playing it by myself and becoming immersed in the world. More and more, I kept coming back to it, unlocking dungeons, trials, and eventually raids, and enjoying the free trial for all it was worth, constantly flirting with the idea of making the plunge and actually buying it. The moment where I was 100% sold was when I finished the base game of A Realm Reborn, and I was just about to begin Heavensward. Up to this point, the main story had been fairly standard. While the characters were solid, and there were a few standout moments here and there, overall it wasn't anything to write home about. That all changed with the preliminary quests into the first expansion, wherein there were twists and turns that truly engaged me for the first time. A momentum that continued with the absolutely incredible story of Heavensward. Don't worry, I'll refrain from spoilers as I don't want to ruin the plot, but I really loved the depth of the storytelling in the expansion, as it dealt with the long-standing history of Ishgard and their messy relationship with dragons spanning hundreds of years. The darker and more mature tone, coupled with a subtly melancholic sense of atmosphere, made for a breath of fresh air compared to the more typical fantasy approach of A Realm Reborn. There's a large focus on political intrigue, as well as a much stronger emphasis on the impact your character, the Warrior of Light, has on current events. Given that your interventions can very well threaten the Ishgardian people's way of life, it goes a long way in putting into perspective how your actions can cause a ripple effect, which may not necessarily be for the better. It's not just a matter of thwarting evildoers. You're stepping into literal centuries worth of history and baggage that can't simply be solved with a few well-intentioned deeds. I'd love to go on, but I'll leave it at that for now. Those that want to know more will have to see for themselves what Heavensward has to offer. The combination of the excellent narrative, the increasing complexity of the game mechanics, as well as my continual understanding of how they work is when things clicked in a profound way. And when it did, I finally decided it was time to buy Final Fantasy XIV. It wasn't long after purchasing FF14 that I truly started to understand that the game gets better the more you put into it. The further along you get into the story, the more engaging it becomes. And the more you understand how the combat functions, the funner it becomes. For a large chunk of my playtime, I exclusively mained as a Dragoon, And while it remains my favorite class, I've since dabbled in several of the other ones, and doing so deepened my appreciation of the different roles everyone fills in a group. This became very clear to me when I decided to try the Dark Knight for the first time, wherein I truly saw what it meant to be a tank. By virtue of adopting this role, I was able to see the exact scenarios I'd already run through as a Dragoon, but now from a very contrasting perspective. Rather than being highly focused on dodging attacks and hitting the enemy, as a tank, I was in essence the leader of the group, dictating the pace of the dungeon and taking care of the party, all the while making sure they weren't getting hurt on account of my inattentiveness. If all the enemies weren't focused on hitting me, I was doing something wrong, because otherwise the team would wipe and it would be my fault. In fact, while it was very infrequent, occasionally when I was matched up with random players that didn't know what they were doing, this would sometimes result in us struggling to make progress due to either the tank just not taking care of the group properly or the healer not being able to keep up. Speaking of which, I'd resisted playing as a healer for the longest time because I generally prefer to be in the thick of the action. But now that I've spent some time as a white mage, I now have a better understanding of the group dynamic. Taking a step back, I realized that it's honestly incredible that even after 700 hours of playing this game, I'm still learning new things. It still feels fresh, and the adventure continues to be fun and engaging. From the story, to the gameplay, to the time I spend with friends, these are the reasons why FF14 has become worth the purchase, and I don't see myself putting it down anytime soon. Before signing off, I wanted to dedicate a section to Alex himself so that he can give his side of events. Take it away, my friend.
I consider you as a close friend of mine, and having spoken to you over the past several years and collaborating on the podcast even, I kind of got to know you a bit better and somehow knew that if you ever played Final Fantasy XIV, you would enjoy the story. I didn't really go into this with the knowledge that you had experience with MMOs before. I literally was just like, this is a great Final Fantasy that more people should play, and it's my hope that Daniel would try it, because I think you'd really enjoy the story and maybe find a different kind of appeal to the game outside of just, hey, it's got a good story. Because I'm not a person who loves MMOs anyway. I'm the kind of guy who spent hours stuck at level 50 Dark Knight in Final Fantasy XI in the early days, and from time to time just spending a few hours a month just trying to level up until, I kind of got sick and left, and then moved on to World of Warcraft, and then pretty much stayed at level 35 because I had a twink warlock, and I never felt like I needed to continue with the game because I wasn't compelled to continue the story. And of course, I've had the experience of getting people who aren't into MMOs, or maybe even people who have just lapsed on MMOs with my wife. My wife swore to me that she would never play MMOs ever again until we both started playing Final Fantasy together. But there's also the aspect of my stream back when I was on Twitch that kind of celebrated the MMO-ness, if you will, the social aspect of Final Fantasy XIV, and really kind of delved into it and enjoyed the fact that I was playing this game with other fans of Final Fantasy. As far as my quote-unquote methods in trying to get Daniel into Final Fantasy XIV, it really was just less calculated than that. It was just all about exclaiming how I really love the story, I love the staff and the development team that worked on it, and proclaiming my adoration of what they were able to do that is almost impossible, which is to make me care about an online game, let alone an MMO, especially after swearing that I would never play any game in the genre ever again. And the way that I kind of approached it outside of talking about it on the podcast when we're still doing the podcast together is just to kind of coax him into trying out the trial. And then from time to time just kind of bringing it up, like, hey, this is what I'm doing in Final Fantasy XIV, it's really fun, that sort of thing. Naturally, when Shadowbringers came out and then they extended the trial, I saw that as another opportunity to get Daniel back, specifically when they started talking about how they were going to crunch A Realm Reborn and make it a shorter experience. Because I've always felt that A Realm Reborn was very problematic in terms of how it onboarded people. It's not perfect still, but this is probably the best that we're ever going to get. In fact, this is probably the best anybody has ever tried something like this before. I'm well aware of like how Warframe, for example, tried to create more friendly beginner experience, realizing that maybe that's just a waste of resources. So the fact that Final Fantasy XIV actually took the time to do this just kind of shows like how much they care about the community and how willing they are to make it grow. And and the rest is history. Daniel downloaded Final Fantasy XIV again, played all the way through Heavensward. And the funny thing about that is that I told him, even before he got into Heavensward, I said to him, I bet you that you're going to subscribe to the game as soon as like you play through Heavensward. And he did. So that kind of prediction, as far as like my immediate friend circle is concerned, even people that I know on Twitter and other social media, that has yet to be proven wrong. So every single time I've seen somebody play through A Realm Reborn, then into Heavensward, as soon as they get into Heavensward and experience the story, they're like, I'm subbing to the game. Obviously, like, I've received some pushback from you, and I wasn't really discouraged by that, because again, part of what I was thinking about was A Realm Reborn was a untenable experience. It was way too long. There are portions of it that are still long, even when they shortened it, but there are parts of it that do become relevant in later storylines, and that's something that Daniel will attest to. And it's just that when you're getting into a game, you don't really think of those things. You don't really think of like, oh, this is going to be important later on. Nobody plays games that way. They're just busy trying to learn what the game is all about and trying to gauge whether they'll want to spend more time with it. The attitude the first time that he and I played is understandable, especially with how the beginning of A Realm Reborn is. It's kind of boring. It's more of an introduction to the world, really, than anything. And then at around level 15 or so, or actually level 10 or so, that's when they start introducing the bad guys. And that's still a long time from 1 to 10. Of course, it's shorter now. But as far as the pushback goes, I felt like it was natural. But I had faith in the developers that they're going to do good for future interested parties. Not just Daniel, but also other people who are interested in Final Fantasy XIV. And they did. And they still continue to improve it to this day, with the sole purpose of making sure that the experience getting into Final Fantasy XIV would be really easy. One of the things that I told Daniel was that every time a new expansion comes, everybody just kind of starts from zero again. Not literally, but the way that they even the playing field, so to speak, is that they change the jobs in such a way that you have to kind of relearn how those work, because they do change it sometimes dramatically and sometimes not. And in that sense, newbies don't really feel like they're left out. They feel like they're relearning the game much like everybody else. And I don't think he was really stubborn. I think he was more like being practical about like his time. It's funny to say that because as of this point, he's already spent 600 hours playing the game, and he never would have thought that he would play a game this long. But here we are. It's all about approaching the game with a fresh perspective. I just had faith that the developers would do something drastic, because they've talked about it before, in order to help people get into it. And when I heard that they were literally going back into A Realm Reborn and shortening that storyline, I was like, that's my opportunity to talk to him again and see if this is any better for him. Because that's the advantage of MMOs, is that they're ever changing and they're ever growing. And to try to approach an MMO with a subscription as if it never changes or it barely changes with the cost is kind of superstition, or an old belief that is perpetuated by how the MMO genre was in its infancy. And by that, I'm not talking about EverQuest. I'm talking about really when it became mainstream with World of Warcraft. Because even then, like, there were updates, but it's like sometimes people were blind to the updates. There's an expansion that's great, and a lot of the updates that were coming to those games were just for the people at the end, which kind of sucks. And so I had this faith that the developers were going to pull through and say, hey, this is another reason why you should try it again. And lo and behold, level 60, Heavensward, you all have seen the meme, and there's a lot more people playing it. When I saw you start to play it by yourself, I kind of knew that the game had its hooks on you, because it stopped becoming a social thing and started becoming a personal experience. Now, granted, I did tell Daniel that to treat it as a single-player MMO, and so it's kind of understandable that he would do it. But for me to see him consistently play it, that's when I started thinking, yeah, he's getting into it. He's getting into the story. He's absorbing a lot of what's happening and really starting to care about the characters and their well-being. As far as Daniel sticking to Final Fantasy XIV and regularly playing it, I definitely didn't doubt that, because as I've said before, Heavensward is the one that hooks people in. And if A Realm Reborn was already kind of sinking its teeth into him ever so slowly, Heavensward is gonna bite his head off, for the lack of a better metaphor. It was literally going to finish him off, so to speak. And it keeps getting proven time and time again that Heavensward is such a strong hook because it actually demonstrates the capability of that platform, the Final Fantasy XIV engine, so to speak, to tell great stories in such a way that it's meaningful to you as an individual. You are the warrior of light, not anybody else's, even though in their game they are their own warriors of light. This is your personal story as the warrior of light. There's an investment there, not just in terms of time, but also to see this story through and to see how it ends. Honestly, it's been kind of fun seeing Daniel go through the content that we've already gone through. There's something magical about experiencing content with other people, and it's even more magical to experience it with people that you know. Our FC, our free company, is comprised of really a small amount of people. There's 5 of us, including Daniel. There's also the issue of running content together. You know, how are we going to divvy up the group, so to speak? But there's also the end game when we start grouping up as a team of 8 people. 5 of us are obviously together on that point, and really tackling these dungeons together as a team and figuring out mechanics, trying to talk to each other over Discord and figuring out what the strat is. And every time I hear him react to the content that he's experiencing for the first time, it kind of fills me with happiness, because it's like, it's exactly why I wanted him to play this game to begin with, is for him to realize and to recognize that taking familiar elements from Final Fantasies, slapping them together, and kind of making not just a cohesive story, but also a unique experience that is only available in Final Fantasy XIV, it has its own appeal that is very different than any other genre, because you're not alone. You are a part of a group, whether it's 7 other people or like 23 other people. I still remember his reaction when we finished the Ivalice raid, like all 3 of them, and getting to the end and seeing that last cutscene. Like, I'll never forget that. You know, as a big Final Fantasy Tactics fan, like, he really, really enjoyed that ending. I still remember his reaction to the ending of the Omega Weapon raids and how it was such a human story, even though it involved the Omega Weapon and this Chocobo, which is literally lifted from like Chocobo Mystery Dungeon games. So it's been a joy trying to kind of experience the game for the first time through him. Talking about MMOs is very difficult. It's something that I've tried to express not just in my videos, but also when talking to people. It's very difficult to get over the fact that there is a financial aspect to it that people just don't understand why it exists. I don't know if Daniel can articulate it better than I can, but the subscription is more than just a money sink. It is an opportunity to create new memories that you can't have in an offline single-player Final Fantasy game. That's the value of multiplayer. That's the value of social. And given that Daniel has experienced the Final Fantasy XIV community, he is now yet one of 20 million people who can attest the fact that the Final Fantasy XIV community is one of the best online communities, not just this genre, but in general. And it's also the reason why a lot of people are migrating from World of Warcraft to Final Fantasy XIV. Something that Naoki Yoshida said in his GDC talk that really touched me was that when he said that MMOs aren't just a developer community interaction. You're literally building a nation where not only are you trying to serve your constituents below you, but you're also serving yourself. And if you, as a developer, enjoy being in that world and being fans of that world, then you know that your community loves it just as much as you. And this has been proven every single time you see them in interviews, in fan fests, and how the community exclaims to the heavens like how awesome this team is. Lately, I've been reading a lot of people's accounts saying how some of their friends are pushing them to play the game, to the point where this one person that I follow on Twitter ended his friendship with his friend after 8 years of being friends with them. And I'd like to think that I wasn't that hands-on with Daniel when trying to convince him to play the game. For me, it was really just all about offering a brand new experience that was going to be wildly different from what he experienced before. And I had no preconceived notions of his experience in other online games. I wasn't even privy to this. In fact, reading the script was pretty much my first exposure to it wholeheartedly. And so I guess for people out there who want to give Final Fantasy XIV a shot, I'll give you the same advice that I gave him. Download the trial, play all the way up until Heavensward, and then ask the question of whether this is worth it for you.
As of recording this, I'm about halfway through the expansion Endwalker. However, as I look back upon my time with FF14, I realize that its appeal has been in stark contrast to RuneScape. What I mean is that I've genuinely enjoyed it as a game, as opposed to RuneScape, which for me was more of a social exercise masquerading as an MMORPG. While I've interacted with friends, namely Alex himself and his group, the Weekend Warriors, whose company I greatly enjoy and am very thankful to have been taken under their wing, at the same time, I yearn to create even more bonds. Kind of like how I did back in the old days. So with that in mind, consider this video an invitation. Whether you're a veteran that wants another companion, or a newcomer that needs a helping hand, please do not hesitate to contact me so that we can go on adventures together. I will leave details in the description below for those that are serious and truly want to play together. I really mean that, by the way. I'd love the chance to meet new people and play through the game together, even if you're just starting off and was inspired to play FF14 through this very video. I'd be happy to help. This has been your humble analyst, Daniel, and I hope to see you all by my side as a comrade in arms in the land of Eorzea.